I was standing in the middle of my living room on a night just before Christmas when my daughter placed a thin red box in front of me and called it a family gift. My son-in-law standing behind her and nodding like this was a pre-approved formality, and it wasn't until I opened the stack of papers and saw the number $520,000 printed in bold on the very first page that I understood I hadn't been invited to celebrate, but to take the fall, to take it on in my name, with my house that I had almost finished paying off, and with the reputation I had protected for 40 years. The humiliation wasn't about the money. It was in the way they spoke, as if my signature was a given. No asking, no discussion, as if a father who had lived his entire life with discipline now had no remaining value except to serve as a free financial backstop. And I realized the greatest insult wasn't the debt itself, but the fact that I had been turned into part of the gift and was still expected to say thank you. If you have ever been publicly diminished in such a cold, deliberate way, if you have ever understood what it feels like to be treated as a backup plan simply because you lived decently and responsibly, leave a and tell me where you are listening to this story from. And if you want to keep following stories where the truth doesn't need to shout, but is still strong enough to make others fall silent, I would truly appreciate a follow. That Christmas Eve, there was no snow. Madison was still, windless, cold just enough for the window panes to give a soft sound when someone touched them. I stood in the kitchen, straightening the frayed edge of the tablecloth, listening to the oven wind down and the faint scent of pine drifting from the Christmas tree. The familiar house felt steady, peaceful, as if everything had been arranged to let another holiday pass without surprises. I had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous things rarely arrive with loud noises. Claire stepped out from the living room, holding a thin box wrapped in red paper. No bow, no bells, just a loosely tied fabric ribbon. She smiled, a gentle smile that conveyed someone who believed she was doing the right thing. Evan followed behind her, stopping near the window, back straight, shoulders open, the posture of a man practiced at standing in front of investors. Together they looked like a carefully color-corrected family portrait, warm, tidy, without a single scratch. "Dad," Claire said, slowly enough to sound thoughtful, "this year we didn't buy stuff. We wanted to give you something more meaningful." I looked at the box. The wrapping paper felt unfamiliar. It didn't resemble packages that usually held sweaters or books. It was thin, flat, and carried the weight of documents, the kind of weight anyone who has lived with contracts recognizes immediately. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and rested my hand on the edge of the table. The cold of the wood sharpened my focus. Evan nodded while Claire spoke, smiling lightly. "It's just you putting your name on it for us for a while so that things can breathe a little." I untied the ribbon. Inside was a neatly assembled file, a clear cover, and a shiny metal clip. The first page carried a bold title, Loan Modification, Personal Guarantee. Beneath it, a number that stood out, clean and chilling, $520,000. I turned the page. The language was precise, the wording calibrated just enough not to frighten. The risk disclosures were pushed to the bottom of the page, while the benefits sat at the top, like light directed exactly where you were meant to look. The signature block was on page 3, a wide space, leaving room for an easy decision. I recognized the structure immediately. Cosign, transfer obligation, shift the weight from those who couldn't carry it to the one who could. "You know this already, Dad." Claire tilted her head, her eyes carrying both trust and quiet pleading. "It's just putting your name on it with us. Temporarily. When things get better—" "Temporarily," Evan repeated like a stamp. I skimmed. It didn't take long. 40 years in commercial brokerage taught me this. Not everything requires time to understand. Some things only need one full pass of the eyes. I saw the asset-backed guarantee clause, saw the path of liability, saw how a single signature could turn a home into collateral for a debt that wasn't mine. The writing was so familiar I almost laughed. Almost. I've handled these before, I said evenly. Clean file. Claire exhaled like a portion of pressure had been released. Evan stepped forward half a step, small enough not to be obvious. We don't want you to think of this as a burden, Claire continued. It's an opportunity for the whole family. Opportunity. I had heard that word more times than necessary in my life. It usually appeared when someone wanted to rename risk. I set the file down on the table, squared it with the edge of the wood. My fingers touched the plastic cover, cool and slick. No one spoke for a few seconds. Evan's eyebrow lifted slightly, very fast, then settled. Claire nodded, her smile unchanged. The room held still for a few beats. The tree lights blinked steadily, as a breath learned long ago. You don't have to sign now, Claire said, just rushed enough to reassure. Just before the new year. I nodded. I didn't sign. We ate dinner. The roast chicken was done just right, the wine warm enough. Claire told a few stories about projects in the pipeline, and Evan talked about potential partners. I listened, nodded, smiled in the right places. In my line of work, you learn how to listen without reacting, because reactions tend to reveal position. When the table was cleared, Claire brought out dessert. Evan poured more wine. Everything moved smoothly, without a crack. To an outsider, it would have looked like a family trying, and trying is often forgiven by society. I saw something else. I saw how the words had been chosen to guide, saw the confidence of people who believed the other side was already prepared. After dinner, I picked up the file again, as if only to put it away. Before stepping into my study, I turned back and looked at Claire. You're right, I said. Some opportunities are worth considering. She smiled. Evan let out a breath. The door closed behind me with a soft click. In the familiar room, I set the papers on the desk, turned on the lamp, and pulled out the chair. The light fell directly onto the carefully arranged clauses. I didn't open my computer. I didn't call anyone. I just looked. People often think brokers sell buildings. They don't see the rest. Reading intent, measuring risk, asking the right questions at the right moment. I had stood in the middle of deals, larger than this many times, had watched families unravel over a single misplaced signature. I knew the feeling of this moment, the moment before a path becomes a slope. I closed the file, placed it in the drawer, and locked it. Not to hide it, but to preserve its exact shape. Some things need to be kept as evidence of themselves. Outside, Claire's laughter carried down the hall. Evan answered. The tree was still lit. Christmas Eve was still calm. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark for a few seconds, long enough to recognize the clearest truth of the entire night. I had seen this kind of paper destroy families who never had time to understand it. I slept very little that night, not because of anger. Anger is loud, obvious, the kind of thing that makes people say words they later have to take back. What kept me awake was a dry, cold feeling, like standing in front of a finished blueprint, lines sharp, specifications complete, missing only one question: does the owner agree or not? I lay still, listening to the wall clock strike its steady rhythm, one beat at a time, unhurried. In the darkness, this house was still breathing. I was counting. The next morning, Madison appeared under a pale light, sliding through the curtains like a testing hand. I made coffee, but didn't turn on any music. Not because I was sad, but because I needed to hear. 40 years in commercial brokerage taught me one very specific thing. When a deal smells off, don't cover it with noise. Let it speak for itself long enough. Claire and Evan woke late. They usually wake late when time doesn't cost them anything. I heard light footsteps on the stairs, the refrigerator opening and glasses touching the stone countertop. Claire made a few comments about last night's dinner. Her voice relaxed, as if the night before had involved nothing more than a cake being passed around. Evan chuckled briefly, then returned to his phone. I nodded, kept my composure. At my age, composure isn't indifference. It's discipline. Around noon, they went out to meet a friend. The front door closed. The engine started. The sound of tires faded along the cold street. I stood by the window for a few seconds, then turned back into the house. Not to do anything in particular, just to return to the familiar rhythm of living. I cleaned the kitchen, wiped the table, and did small tasks that kept my hands busy so my mind wouldn't slide toward emotion. Near 4 in the afternoon, they came back. A paper bag from an organic store landed on the kitchen counter. A few overpriced items, never quite enough to be called a contribution. Claire went straight upstairs. Evan dropped onto the living room sofa. I was in my study, the door not fully closed, a habit of someone with nothing to hide. I read a few pages, wrote a few short lines, then stood up and went upstairs to grab the coat hanging in the laundry room. The wooden stairs creaked softly. I moved slowly, not because I was afraid of being heard, but because there was no need to create extra sound. When I reached the middle of the staircase, I heard Claire's voice coming from the living room. The front door wasn't locked. The door to Evan's office was cracked open. They always lived like that, the carelessness of people who believe everything in this house, even the space itself, belongs to them. Claire's voice was low but clear, clear enough that no effort was needed to hear it. She wasn't on the phone. She was speaking to Evan quietly enough not to bother hiding, loudly enough that someone standing in the right place could hear every word. I recognized that tone immediately. Soft, bright, with a hint of excitement. The same tone she used as a child, when she bragged about doing something wrong and not getting caught. Only this time, it wasn't a child's game. I stopped. Out of long professional reflex, I slid my phone out of my coat pocket, didn't look at the screen, just moved my thumb by habit to turn on the recorder. I didn't raise it. I didn't hide it. I simply let it rest in my palm, the way I always had during important exchanges, to preserve words as they were spoken, not to reinterpret them through emotion. I told you. Claire laughed softly, her voice stretched out, speaking plainly to Evan. He'll sign, don't worry. I stood still, not because of the sentence itself, but because of how it was said, certain, casual, like an assumed fact. No if, no question, no space for my will to enter. We wrapped it as a gift, Claire continued, her voice sharpening slightly. A Christmas gift. If he refuses, it'll look really bad, like a father turning his back on his daughter right during the holidays. I placed my hand on the stair rail. The wood was cold. I wasn't shaking. I just felt something sink in my chest, like the moment you look at a contract and realize the escape route has been prepared for someone else, and the load-bearing weight is meant for you. Evan said something very quiet, low, like a confirmation already discussed. Claire nodded and went on, without needing another thought. We use his home equity, obviously, Claire said to Evan, her voice steady. The house has value. He's almost done paying it off. Credit score speaks for itself. He lived his whole life like a balance sheet. Clean, solid, stable. Banks love that. My throat went dry, not because of the amount. I had seen more numbers than one lifetime ever needed. What dried my throat was the way she referred to my entire life of discipline as a resource to be extracted. She wasn't looking at me as her father. She was looking at me as a file. We say it's just co-signing, Claire continued, a hint of glee in her voice. But really, it's transferring responsibility. Once he signs, it's done. Then we can breathe. New year, clear heads, take a trip or something. I'm already eyeing a ski vacation, kind of a reward. I heard Evan give a short, quiet laugh, the laugh of someone who has already seen the outcome. Claire didn't lower her voice. That was where the contempt lived. They didn't need to hide. In their minds, I wasn't capable of reacting. He's always talking about responsibility, Claire said, her tone mimicking slightly, pressing on a familiar habit. So we just push the right button. Dad lives for his reputation. He won't let his daughter lose face in front of her husband. I closed my eyes for exactly one beat. In my mind, the image from last night surfaced, the red box on the table, Evan standing behind it, the Christmas tree lights blinking. I had thought it was the tact of grown-ups. It wasn't. It was a script. And I had been assigned a very clear role. Sign. Evan let out a small laugh. Claire laughed with him. Then Claire's next sentence landed, light but filthy. Besides, she said, Dad owes us anyway. 3 years living here. He's not lonely. He has us for company. If you really balance it out, he should be thanking us. I opened my eyes and looked down at the step beneath my feet. 3 years. Company. Gratitude. I heard those words the way you hear a stranger read out an expense ledger for family ties. The cold inside me wasn't from the weather. It was the cold of a boundary that had been erased. Claire went on, lowering her voice further, like she was sharing a practical tip. Don't say debt. Just say helping us by putting his name on it. Say for the family. Say gift. Let him think he's the hero. He likes that feeling. I stood in the middle of my own staircase, like someone walking past a courtroom and hearing the sentence read before his name is called. No one asked whether I agreed. They were only discussing how I would be unable to refuse. I didn't move forward. I didn't turn away. I stood there long enough to hear everything. Not out of curiosity, but because I needed the truth in its original form. Unedited, unsweetened, not masked, by Dad. Spoken over dinner. When Claire finished, she turned to Evan and nodded, like closing out a task already completed. Evan stood up and walked into the kitchen. The conversation ended cleanly without needing further confirmation. I turned back and returned to my study. This time, the stairs made less noise. Maybe because I placed my feet more precisely. I closed the door, didn't lock it. I sat down, stared at the space in front of me, then took out my phone. I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I opened my notes and wrote a single line, short and direct, exactly as professional habit dictated. Christmas. Gift equals transfer of obligation. Use equity plus credit score. No asking. Assumed. I paused, looked at the line for a moment. To an outsider, it might look like calculation. To me, it was how I kept myself from collapsing. When you put the truth down on paper, it stops biting you. It stays there, waiting to be handled. Outside the room, Claire called out, Dad, want some coffee? Her voice was sweet, harmless, exactly the voice of someone who has just said something cruel and still expects you to smile. I heard Evan turn on the television. The house kept functioning like any other day. I answered in a normal voice, steady enough for them to believe I was still the same Dad as before. Yeah, I'll be right down. I stood up, adjusted my collar, stepped out, carrying something I hadn't had the night before. Certainty. Not certainty that they were bad people, but certainty that I had been placed into a role they considered automatic. And in that exact moment, I understood a sentence my life had proven many times before. Only this time it lived inside my own family. They didn't ask whether I agreed. They only calculated how I would be unable to refuse. I didn't ask. I didn't bring up what I had heard. After that moment, standing in the middle of the staircase, I understood very clearly. Asking questions only helps people prepare answers, while silence forces them to keep living exactly as they already live. And that way of living, given enough time, will say everything on its own. In the days leading up to Christmas, the house returned to its familiar rhythm, smooth and even, no tension, no avoidance. Claire still brewed coffee every morning with expensive dark roast beans, the thick, heavy aroma overpowering even the old wood smell of the kitchen. Evan came down the stairs with the relaxed gait of someone who doesn't count hours or measure money. I greeted them, nodded, and smiled just enough. At my age, calm isn't weakness, it's discipline. I began to observe, not secretly, just noticing what was openly displayed in shared space. Claire's car sat in the driveway, leased on a premium plan with a fresh registration sticker and leather seats still creased. I'd seen that kind of choice many times. Not buying to own, but buying to look like you're moving forward. Progress by appearance usually drags silent costs behind it. On the weekend, they left the house. Small suitcases rolled across the floor, wheels steady and light. Just a change of scenery, Claire said casually. Evan called it networking. I stood by the window watching them go, then turned back to the kitchen table. A few parking receipts lay there, loosely placed, downtown rates, weekend pricing. Not details worth hiding, because they didn't think anyone would connect them to the story of things being tight. They came back smelling of sun and perfume mixed. The refrigerator is filled with neatly packaged organic containers, soft colors, and not-so-soft prices. A new gym membership card appeared in the shared drawer, next to a stack of unopened mail. I didn't touch it. I just saw it. Some signals don't need contact to be understood. Dinner went on as usual. Claire talked about pressure, about the next few months needing to tighten up. Evan spoke about partners, his tone confident, sentences polished but absent of numbers. I listened, nodded, didn't correct. Why is the question of someone who wants to argue? I didn't need to argue with the story already contradicting itself. I noticed the small things, the things usually dismissed as insignificant. Claire's handbag changed week to week. Evan's watch changed with his outfits. A food delivery app notification lit up on a phone left on the table, then vanished quickly. In the recycling bin, a box from a newly released tech product. I didn't bend down. When your line of sight is high enough, you don't need to bend. One evening, Claire said they needed to cut back for a few months. At the same moment, her phone lit up, a reservation confirmation for a new restaurant. She turned it off quickly. The reflected glow on the glass was enough. Things that don't match tend to illuminate themselves. Evan mentioned trimming expenses, then set his car keys on the table. A heavy new keychain, cold metal. I didn't ask the price. I just registered the timing between words and evidence. They didn't acknowledge each other. They stood at opposite ends of the room. I kept living as usual. Woke early, made coffee, read a few pages, wrote a few lines. I didn't change my rhythm to trigger suspicion. Sudden change is the signal of someone about to react. Consistency is the best cover. One afternoon, I cleared out a shared drawer looking for a pen. Inside were reward cards, parking stubs, and a few neatly folded receipts. I didn't open more. I didn't dig. I just saw enough to know that the story of struggling required a lot of props to stay upright. They laughed, often and on cue, but the laughter was different from before. It didn't burst out of joy. It fired to fill space. I'd heard that sound in closed conference rooms, where people tell clean stories in steady voices while their eyes slide past the financials behind them. I didn't say I had heard. I didn't say I was seeing, because speaking invites revision. Silence lets the performance continue long enough for the seams to show. In commercial brokerage, you don't argue when a story doesn't line up. You let it contradict itself. One night, after they went to bed early, I stayed in the living room. Most lights were off, but the hallway light was enough to illuminate the tabletop. Evan's wallet lay forgotten, a card edge visible. I didn't touch it. I stood up, turned off another light, and went upstairs. Discipline is knowing where to stop, and knowing when action isn't needed yet. In those days, I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry either. Emotion had passed its noisy phase. What replaced it was a cold clarity, the kind that arrives only when all the pieces start settling into the right places. I understood that if I asked, they would answer. If I objected, they would persuade. But if I stayed silent, they would keep talking, and talk far more than necessary. I opened my old notebook, the worn cover familiar, not an accounting ledger. I didn't write much, only what couldn't be denied. Dates, events, objects appearing in shared space. No commentary, no interpretation, just the presence of fact. The pages turned evenly, the pen moved lightly. I didn't feel like I was preparing a strike. I was only doing the most familiar thing of my life, holding a story still long enough to see it clearly. And at the bottom of the page, I wrote one line, not as a conclusion, but as a reminder to maintain discipline to the end. In my line of work, when a story doesn't line up, I don't argue. I document. There are nights when the house has long fallen asleep, and the last remaining sound is the refrigerator's faint hum, when memory returns without warning. It isn't loud, it comes slowly, sets a hand on your shoulder like an old acquaintance, then sits down exactly where you've been trying not to look. My wife died early. Too early for a man to learn how to become two pillars at once. On the day of the funeral, Claire was just old enough to understand that her mother would not be coming back, but not old enough to understand how an ordinary morning could end in a silence that large. She stood pressed close to me the entire time, her small hand gripping mine as if letting go for even a second would cause the whole world to slip away. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just stood there, far too still for a child who had just lost her mother. That night, when the house had gone quiet and only the two of us remained, the scent of mourning clothes still heavy in the air, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked up at me, her voice so soft it felt like it might break the room itself. "Dad, so we won't get to see Mom anymore, right? From now on, our house is missing Mom, isn't it?" I remember staying silent for a long beat, long enough to swallow the tightness in my throat, then bending down, pulling her into my chest, and answering in the calmest voice I could find. "Our house is missing Mom, but Dad is here. Dad will take care of you, I promise." I kept that promise. The years that followed weren't easy, but they weren't dramatic either. I went to work, came home, cooked, did laundry, learned to divide time the way I divided money, carefully, with planning. I didn't try to compensate with luxuries. I compensated with presence. Being there on time for parent meetings, in the stands at her first game, in the room when Claire was sick with a high fever in the middle of the night. Some things can't be bought with money, and I chose to pay with time. I taught her about money early, not through lectures, but through habit. We kept a glass jar on the kitchen shelf. Whenever Claire wanted to buy something, I had her put part of her savings into the jar. When it filled, we counted together. I taught her that every number has an origin, every object has a cost, not just a price tag, but the hours of work behind it. Claire nodded seriously, as if it were a law of nature. Once she asked why we didn't switch to a new car like her friends' families. I told her the car still ran fine and money should be saved for things that mattered more. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Then when I grow up, I won't spend recklessly either." I believed her. I believed her because there was no calculation in her eyes when she said it, only a desire to do right. In those years, Claire was very different. She knew how to wait her turn. She knew how to ask before taking. She knew how to apologize when she was wrong. I saw her learn the most important lesson of all. Not everyone is responsible for carrying the consequences for you. I thought I had taught enough. Later, when Claire grew older and went to college, I kept the same approach. I didn't interfere too deeply, but I was always there if needed. I helped her build a budget, showed her how to read contracts, explained interest, explained risk. I didn't want her to fear money. I wanted her to respect it. Respect meant understanding limits. On the day Claire graduated, she hugged me tightly. I remember that moment clearly, a hug without calculation, without conditions. She said, "I did it, Dad." I thought, "Yes, you're standing on your own." Then things began to change, not in a single day. There was no clear stumble, just small shifts. Words started to include deserve. Decisions were justified with everyone does it. Spending was reframed as investing in image. I saw it, but I didn't stop it. Partly because I trusted her, partly because I thought it was the cost of growing up, collide, then self-correct. I didn't realize something else was quietly being cultivated, a sense of entitlement, entitled to help, entitled to a safety net, entitled to someone standing behind you to clean up when things went too far. That feeling doesn't come from hardship. It comes from prolonged protection without clear boundaries. When Evan entered the picture, I saw the change accelerate. Not because he was bad from the start, but because he brought a different value system. Fast, glossy, victory-oriented. Claire began talking about leverage, about opportunity. I listened and repeated the old rules. Read carefully. Don't rush. Don't use what you aren't prepared to lose. Claire nodded, but her eyes no longer lingered the way they used to. Now, looking back, I understand that betrayal rarely comes from lack. It comes when people believe they deserve more than they have, and that belief isn't corrected in time. I fixed many things in my life, contracts, deals, plans. But one thing I corrected too late: the boundary between helping and replacing responsibility. That night, I sat alone in my study and opened an old notebook. Not a professional ledger, but a family record. Short lines about birthdays, about Claire's first savings, about the summer she bought her bicycle with money she earned herself. Those pages didn't lie. They reminded me that she once knew how to stand on her own feet. I closed the notebook, not sad, not angry, just a quiet regret, deep enough to need no lament. I didn't raise my child for her to depend. I also didn't raise her for her to forget who stood beside her the entire way. I stood up and looked around the room, old photographs, the traces of a lifetime of fatherhood done quietly. Outside, the house remained still. Claire continued living in her familiar rhythm, believing everything had already been arranged. And in that moment, I said one sentence to myself, like a final boundary, needing no audience. I raised my child so she could stand firm, not so she could stand on me. I didn't look at the number first. I looked at the story they were telling, then compared it to how they were actually living. In my line of work, that is always the first step. When words and reality are placed side by side long enough, the flaw reveals itself without force. I sat at my desk very early while the house was still quiet and my mind clear enough not to be led by emotion. I didn't turn on the printer. I didn't call anyone. I took a blank sheet of paper and drew 2 clear columns. On one side was what Claire and Evan had told me: struggling, temporarily unemployed, waiting for cash flow, just need to get through a few months. On the other side was what I saw every day in this house: a premium lease car parked out front, regular weekend trips away, reservations at new restaurants, a newly issued gym membership, handbags changing constantly, watches swapped to match outfits. I added no commentary. I simply wrote them down and let them face each other. I had once taught Claire that money itself doesn't lie. People do it on its behalf. And when distortion lasts long enough, money leaves traces. All of it is open record. Anyone can see it if they are willing to look. I started with public records, business registrations, commercial histories, previously disclosed transactions. None of it was secret. It just required patience to connect. Evan's name appeared in a few familiar places, some older projects, a few companies that had operated and then changed status. Not many, but enough to know he wasn't empty-handed. I noted timelines without judgment, only dates. Then I noticed what had been left behind. In the recycling bin were partially torn envelopes. On the kitchen counter, a hastily folded statement. I didn't open anything. I only looked at what had already been exposed. The figures weren't large enough to shock, but they didn't align with the story of waiting for work. I placed the marker of unemployment next to the spending patterns. The gap between them wasn't quiet. People who are truly short on money don't live like that, unless there's another source behind it. I didn't need to know what that source was. Knowing it existed was enough. I drew another table, cash flow over time. Not detailed enough to invade privacy, just enough to see the shape. Some expenses ran steady, some spiked, some dipped irregularly. I had seen this pattern many times professionally, stable on the surface, more complex underneath. The figure of $520,000 came into focus then. Round, clean, easy on the ear, chosen so it wouldn't frighten. But in business, attractive numbers are usually just the surface. I traced the fine print mentally: guarantees, contingent obligations, trigger conditions. I didn't need the original documents to understand. I only needed to know how these papers are structured. Once everything was laid out, I understood immediately. 520,000 wasn't the whole problem. It was only the front-facing portion. Behind it were other bindings, other liabilities that could surface later when conditions shifted. Those weren't mentioned because mentioning them would make the gift too heavy. I remembered the Christmas Eve file. Benefits at the top of the page, risks buried at the bottom, the signature placed where it was easiest to sign. I had seen this many times before, not selling debt, but selling reassurance, not asking for consent, but assuming the burden would be carried. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel naively deceived. What I saw was a familiar method, transferring risk from the party in trouble to the one with stable assets, from the weak credit file to the clean one. It isn't loud, it isn't crude, it's polite, and because it's polite, it's dangerous. I stacked the papers neatly. I didn't rush to a conclusion. In my work, understanding structure matters more than reacting quickly. Once you see how something is built, the next step is simply to watch who will try to push it forward. Before closing the notebook, I wrote one sentence to myself to anchor the essential truth. This is not a simple debt. It is a method of shifting risk onto someone else. After seeing the true nature of that money, I didn't make a scene. I didn't question them further either. I understood very clearly that if I acted emotionally at this point, everything would get tangled. I needed to know where I stood legally and where the safe boundary was so I wouldn't push myself into a trap. So I went to a lawyer who specializes in elder clients and family assets, Margaret Sloan. Her office was small, not flashy. A modest nameplate, a few neat stacks of files. Quiet, the kind of place people go to handle real matters, not to vent. Margaret didn't ask how strained my family situation was. She didn't ask if I was hurt. She asked one single question. What do you want to protect? I handed her everything I had documented. Timelines, papers, the gap between what they said and how they spent. I added no commentary, no conclusions. I let her read. Margaret reviewed everything carefully, especially the fine print, the parts most people skip because they assume they're not important. After a while, she set the file down and said plainly, "There are signs of financial exploitation of an older adult, and the risk lies in how they're trying to manufacture consent through emotion." She explained it in very simple terms. When someone in a family uses emotional language to pressure an older person into signing documents, putting their name on obligations, or assuming liability, while not fully disclosing the risks, that is no longer voluntary help. It is a form of exploitation. Margaret added something important that many people confuse. Protecting assets is not revenge. Protection is about keeping your money, your home, your reputation from being dragged into matters that are not yours. Revenge is about wanting to hurt someone else. These are completely different things. If you mix them up, the first person who suffers is usually you. She also clearly distinguished civil from criminal matters. Civil actions are what I could do immediately, separating liability, locking down authority, blocking paths of risk transfer. Criminal matters are different, requiring stronger evidence, and not something to pursue early unless necessary. Margaret didn't encourage me to go further than needed. The law doesn't like noise, she said. The law needs sequence. We agreed on a guiding principle. I didn't need confrontation, accusation, or a dramatic reveal. I only needed to stand in the correct position and take the correct steps so I wouldn't be pulled into a debt structure that wasn't mine. Everything else, if there was more, would surface on its own over time. Before I left, Margaret said one short, honest sentence. Not professional jargon, but the kind of reminder that comes from seeing too many families fracture from acting too fast. You don't need to strike back. You just need to make sure they can't drag you down with them. I walked out, with more clarity than I'd had in a long time. Not because everything was suddenly safe, but because I knew I was moving in the right direction, no longer walking in the dark. After meeting with the lawyer, I didn't rush into anything else. I didn't make phone calls. I didn't bring up old conversations. I let everything sit, like still water before something heavy is dropped in. Once I understood the legal boundaries, there was only one step left: verifying the truth through numbers, the kind of truth that shows no mercy to anyone. Daniel Price was the person Margaret referred me to, a true forensic analyst. Speaks little, asks precisely, works through records. We met at a quiet cafe, a table by the window. Daniel arrived on time, set down his briefcase, opened his laptop. No extended greetings. He asked directly, "What's the objective?" I answered just as briefly, "See whether the story they're telling can stand." Daniel nodded. That was enough. Daniel didn't need private documents. He worked with what anyone could access if they knew where to look: public records, asset registrations, business filings, permissible credit histories. Forensic work isn't sneaky, it's proper assembly. Every piece has a source. Every conclusion has a traceable path. The results came slowly, but firmly. Daniel sent me a clean summary sheet, no flair, no exclamation points, just straight lines. In it, Evan appeared very different from the image of struggling he had been presenting. There were assets held under related legal entities. There were circular cash flows, nothing flashy but consistent, the pattern of someone who knows how to keep money from sitting still in one place. Then there was Claire. Daniel flagged a small but heavy detail. When opening certain credit accounts, marital status had been disclosed in a flexible way. Not immediately illegal, but enough to improve borrowing terms. A familiar tactic for those wanting to lighten the present burden and push the heavier part into the future. Daniel didn't judge. He simply circled it and wrote, "Inconsistent disclosure." I read slowly, not because it was hard to understand, but because every line pulled up the same old question. If they weren't poor, why build a story of being poor? Daniel answered before I asked. He said it plainly. They're not short on money. They just want someone else to pay. We went through it again. Everything rested on open records. Forensic standard. No speculation. No leaps. Daniel explained why the conclusion held. Hidden assets aren't meant for display. They're meant for preservation. The story of struggling exists to open the door for transferring responsibility. The two don't contradict each other. They complete each other. Daniel ended with a brief caution. Don't touch them. Don't let them know you've seen this. When people believe the script is still running, they keep acting. I understood. In my own line of work, markets reveal themselves when they aren't pushed. That night, I came home later than usual. The house was quiet. I sat at my desk and organized the summaries. I didn't lock them away. I didn't display them. I just placed them where they belonged. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. Emotion had given way to clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't need volume. I wrote one line in my notebook, enough to close Daniel's part and open the next step. They're not poor. They just don't want to pay. Part 8. The red gift box. Once the numbers were clear, there was nothing left to guess. The task now wasn't to find more evidence, but to arrange what I already had in the correct order. I told no one. I didn't reveal how prepared I was. I simply began working step by step, the way I had my entire life. I chose a red box, not a glossy luxury gift box, but a thick, sturdy paper box from an office supply store. I chose red deliberately, because that was the color Claire had used when she handed me the documents on Christmas Eve. I wanted symmetry, not to mock, but so no one could claim I had done anything differently. I opened the box and placed the first item inside, the audit. Not a long report, just a clean, verified summary. Cash in, cash out, timelines, data sources. Every entry had a reason for existing. Not a single extra word. Even someone who didn't understand finance could look at it and see one thing immediately. Their spending didn't match the story they told. I placed the audit on top. Whoever opened the box would see it first. I didn't underline anything. I didn't add notes. The numbers were enough to speak for themselves. Beneath it, I placed the notice terminating residency rights. This document had been carefully reviewed by the lawyer. Neutral language, clear deadlines, solid legal grounding, no threats, no heavy phrasing. It stated only one fact. From this point forward, staying in this house was no longer automatic. I didn't see this as punishment. It was a boundary that should have existed from the beginning, before things were pushed too far. Finally, I added the trust amendment appendix. Short, precise. It did exactly one thing. Separated all of my assets from any obligation not directly created by me. No exceptions, no explanations, no emotion, just protection. When those 3 items were settled in the box, I added one small thing in the corner. A plastic toy calculator. Cheap, clicky buttons. I had bought it long ago when Claire was little to help her learn basic addition and subtraction. I kept it not out of nostalgia, but because it reminded me of something simple. There was a time when she learned to work with numbers without schemes attached. I didn't write a letter. I left no note. I didn't feel any need to explain further. What was inside the box already said everything clearly. The audit was the truth. The residency notice was the boundary, the trust. Amendment was the final answer. The little calculator just sat there, saying nothing. But everyone would understand it belonged to a different time. I closed the lid, sealed the box, and placed it neatly on my desk. I didn't hide it. I didn't display it. I left it where it could be seen if someone walked into the room. Outside, life in the house continued as usual. They were still talking, still laughing, still believing everything would end with a signature the way they had planned. I stood up, turned off the office light, and left the red box under the hallway glow. I felt no nerves. I felt no weight. I only felt that everything was ready, in the correct order. Before leaving, I thought about how they had called those papers a gift. I reminded myself of one simple sentence. Needing no further explanation, they wrapped debt for me. I wrapped the truth for them. Christmas dinner unfolded exactly as they had expected. The table was carefully set, the tablecloth smooth, candles spaced just right, everything neat like a rehearsed presentation. Claire sat across from me, her expression gentle. Evan sat beside his wife, back straight, one hand resting lightly on the chair, the posture of someone accustomed to controlling the room. To my right sat Mark Ellison, a longtime friend who had worked in commercial banking with me years earlier. I had invited Mark for a simple reason. Dinner for company. No one asked anything more. After the main course, Claire stood and retrieved several gift boxes from under the tree. She followed the ritual precisely. Mark first, then Evan, and finally me. When it was my turn, I didn't open it right away. I set the box aside, poured more water, made a few polite remarks. Claire glanced at Evan. Evan gave a small nod. They waited. "Dad, open your gift," Claire said softly, just enough to prompt, without pressing. I stood, walked to the desk beside the dining room, and picked up the red box I had prepared. I placed it in the center of the table, replacing the thin box they had given me that night. The red was the same. The size was completely different. The air in the room dropped a beat. "My gift," I said. "Let's open it together." Evan raised an eyebrow. Claire smiled, but the corners of her mouth had stiffened. Mark looked at the box, then at me, the look of a man more familiar with documents than with words. I nodded. Evan lifted the lid. The first thing revealed was the audit. Evan picked it up, flipped through a few pages. His face changed color so quickly he couldn't hide it. Claire leaned over to look. She read fast, then stopped at the comparison between declared income and actual spending. No one spoke. Christmas music continued playing from the living room. but no one was listening. Evan set the audit down, trying to steady himself. Dad, what is this? What you're living, I answered. Place next to what you told me. Claire reached in and turned the next page. The notice terminating residency rights lay directly beneath. She picked it up and read line by line, more slowly this time. When she reached the deadline, her hand was visibly shaking. Are you really going to do this? Claire asked, her voice low. I'm acting within the law, I replied, and with sufficient notice. Evan half stood, then sat back down. He tugged at his collar and took a long breath, like someone realizing he was in the wrong room. Mark didn't interrupt. He studied the documents closely. Only then did he speak, brief and precise, the way bankers do. This audit is solid. Data sources are clear. Evan snapped his head toward Mark. You knew about this? I found out tonight, Mark said. Just enough to see. Evan opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire reached for her husband's arm, but Evan brushed it away. Not roughly, just enough to separate. I took my phone from my pocket and placed it on the table. There's one more thing, I said, so we don't have to argue. I pressed play. Claire's voice filled the room, clear, unmistakable. Not the voice she used at the dinner table, but the one used when she thought no one needed to be respected, the way she framed it as a gift. The emphasis on just putting his name on it, the talk of home equity, credit score, and how Dad won't dare refuse. Evan's voice cut in, short laughs, quick affirmations. Each sentence landed on the table like a cross-verified figure. Claire sprang to her feet. Dad, turn it off. I let it play a few seconds more. Enough. Then I stopped it. The room fell completely silent. Evan lowered his head, both hands on his knees, shoulders slumped. The posture of a presenter was gone. What remained was a man facing a mirror at the wrong moment. That's not what I meant, Claire stammered. Meaning lives in the words, I said. Not in how you explain them afterward. Evan looked up, eyes red. You're humiliating us. I met his gaze. You did that first, only you did it in the dark. Mark stood, slipped on his coat. I think the rest should stay within the family, he said. Then he turned to Evan, his voice firm, no longer polite. And let me say one honest thing. Never bring paperwork like this out during the holidays. It only works on people who don't read carefully. With someone who understands, it just exposes you. Evan let out a dry laugh. Claire sat down, tears falling now without rhythm. No one comforted her. No one needed to. Everything that mattered was already on the table. I slid the red box toward them slowly. There's an additional appendix in there, I said. The trust has been amended. Not to punish, to protect. Evan looked at me, his voice breaking. What do you think we are? I think you're adults, I replied, and adults are responsible for their choices. I stood and calmly gathered the documents back into the box. No rush, no force. I didn't need to win anything that night. The truth had already stood up for me. Before leaving the table, I said one sentence, clear enough for all three to hear. This is the private part. What comes next won't stay in this room. Evan lowered his head. Claire stopped crying. Mark looked at me and gave a small nod. And I knew this was not yet the public part. After Mark left, the house returned to its usual state with surprising speed. The dining table still smelled of coffee. The Christmas tree lights were still on. Only the air was different. Thick, heavy, as if every sentence just spoken was still suspended near the ceiling. Claire cleared the dishes in silence. Evan leaned against the sink, eyes fixed on the floor. I went into my study and closed the door just enough to separate myself from the sounds outside. I didn't rush. I washed my hands, dried them, then sat down. Years in my profession taught me one thing. When the informational work is done, what remains is process. I opened my contacts and made the first call. The bank picked up after 3 rings. I spoke briefly within context, without telling a family story. I stated only this. There were risk indicators and a need to reassess commitments tied to a specific file. The person on the other end acknowledged, asked for a few reference points. I answered with facts, no emotion. The call ended in under 3 minutes. I noted the time. The second call was to an old commercial creditor, someone I had worked with for many years. I didn't ask for favors. I simply forwarded a summary, along with standardized documentation. The response came faster than expected. "We'll review immediately," they said. I thanked them and hung up. I made 2 more calls, one to compliance, one to a risk assessment unit. Each followed the same structure. Identify the issue, provide evidence, confirm receipt, no debate, no persuasion. When paperwork stands, words only serve as directions. Around 11 that night, Evan's phone began vibrating repeatedly in the living room. I heard him answer one call, voice tight, then a second, then a third. Each time he ended a call, his shoulders dropped a little more. Claire stepped out, asked quietly. Evan shook his head, signaling silence. The house slowly filled with fragmented sounds. Notifications, messages, missed calls. I didn't step out. I let everything unfold on its own. This wasn't confrontation. This was consequence triggered by structure. Near midnight, an email arrived in the shared family inbox. Neutral subject line, temporary credit, hold notification. Polite content, additional time required for verification. Shortly after, another email from a different entity. Request for supplementary information. No accusations. Just questions. And in this field, questions are the first doors closing. Evan walked quickly toward my study, stopped at the door, knocked once. I opened it. He spoke directly. No. Detours. What did you do? I did my part, I replied. I protected the boundary. My credit, Evan swallowed. They're temporarily freezing it. Temporarily, I said, until things are clarified. Claire stood behind him, pale. Dad, this will spread, she said. I know, I replied, and it will spread along documented lines. Evan turned away and grabbed his phone. I heard him call a partner. The conversation was short and tense. On the other end, someone's voice lowered, then stopped. When Evan hung up, he said nothing more. That silence said enough. The next morning, the first signs appeared. 1 meeting postponed, 2 unanswered emails, 1 call that rang and disconnected. Not through gossip, through calendars being moved, through delayed replies, through the phrase, "We'll get back to you." People who used to meet Evan at networking events suddenly became busy. No one scolded, no one accused. They simply pulled their hands back. By noon, another notice arrived. Creditworthiness under review. Soft language, hard impact. Evan sat at the dining table, staring at the screen, hands motionless. Claire made tea, set it in front of him, then stood there, unsure what to say. I ate lunch alone in my study. When I finished, I cleaned up neatly, as always. My private task had been completed the night before. The public part was now running on its own. In the afternoon, Evan received a call from a professional association. I heard the words, temporary suspension, and pending verification. When he hung up, he leaned against the wall and exhaled. No tears, just the late realization that reputations don't disappear with noise. They disappear with absence. That evening, Claire came into my room. She spoke softly, voice hoarse. "You didn't have to do this." "I did," I replied, "so it wouldn't happen again." Claire lowered her head. Evan stood in the hallway, not stepping inside. I glanced at the clock. Everything was moving on schedule. Night fell, no arguments, no slammed doors, just notifications continuing to arrive. Steady, polite, cold. I turned off the light, drew the curtains, and prepared to sleep. Before leaving the desk, I wrote one final line in my notebook. No one raised their voice, but every door closed. 3 days after that dinner, the house began to change its rhythm. No more late mornings, no more calling to each other from the staircase. Everything moved quietly, according to the sequence of signed papers and stamped notices. The termination of residency was delivered by hand, valid, with proper notice. No arguments, no negotiations. just time beginning to count. Evan packed first. He moved fast, efficiently, as if trying to shorten the distance he still had to stay. Cardboard boxes lined up, tape pulled in straight lines. The items once displayed on the dining table were now mixed in with everyday clothes. No one asked for extra space. No one asked me to hold on to anything. The living room gradually emptied, revealing patches of floor that rarely saw light. Claire was slower. She walked back and forth, picked things up and set them down again, as if she still hadn't decided what truly belonged to her. On Thursday afternoon, after Evan had taken the last load to the parking lot, Claire returned alone. She stood outside my study door for a long time. I knew because the wall clock marked every beat. "Dad," Claire said when I opened the door, her voice hoarse, unperformed. "I'm sorry." I didn't invite her in right away. I stayed in the doorway, giving that sentence space to land. An apology is a beginning, not an ending. "Go on," I said. Claire took a deep breath. "I was wrong. I thought you would carry it. I thought everything would be fine if you signed." "And if I had signed," I asked, "what would have come after?" She fell silent. This time the silence wasn't avoidance. It was the pause of someone finally seeing the road they were on. I opened the door wider and motioned her inside. She sat in the chair across from me. I sat at the desk, without a pen. This conversation didn't need notes. "I accept your apology," I said, "but I need to make the boundaries clear." Claire nodded. "First," I continued, "you move out on time. No extensions. No exceptions." She nodded again. "Second," I said, "from today on, your finances are separate from mine. I don't co-sign. I don't guarantee. I don't sign for you." Claire lowered her head. "Third," I said slowly, "I'm still your father, but I am no longer a backup plan." She looked up, eyes red. "Do you still love me?" "Yes," I answered, "and because I do, I keep the boundary." Claire cried, quietly. Tears fell evenly, like someone who understands there are things that can't be recovered by lowering your voice. I let her cry long enough. I didn't hand her a tissue right away. I didn't console her. Adults need to finish crying before they can stand straight. The next day, Evan came back for the last few items. He didn't look at me for long, just nodded, more polite than before. I nodded back. Nothing more was needed. The papers had said enough. Moving day arrived exactly on schedule. The truck parked in front of the gate. Neighbors walked past, glanced, and kept going. No one stopped to ask. Everything unfolded in the way society calls normal. Claire locked her room door one last time and placed the key on the kitchen counter. She stood there for one more beat and then turned away. I walked them to the gate. No hugs, no holding back. I said one sentence, just loud enough. "Take care of yourself." Claire replied softly, "I'll try." When the truck drove away, the street in front of the house returned to silence. I went back inside, closed the door, checked the lock. I walked through each room, opened the windows, let the air in. The house needed to breathe again at its own pace. That evening, I rearranged the living room. The newly exposed empty spaces didn't make me feel lost. They made things clear. Clear that some things leave not to be reclaimed, but to show you what must be protected in the life that remains. I turned off the lights, sat in my familiar chair, opened my notebook, and wrote one line, brief and sufficient to close this chapter. Justice doesn't need to shout. It stands still and waits. Spring arrived slowly, just enough to make it clear that what had closed did not need reopening. I began my days with the same old routine. Brewing coffee, opening the curtains, watching the light cross the room at a familiar angle. The house was quiet, no longer layered with overlapping rhythms. That quiet wasn't empty. It was orderly, like a desk cleared after the final document has been signed. I sold a commercial asset on an ordinary morning. No signing ceremony, no photos. Just a punctual meeting, papers neatly aligned, a decisive signature. That building had been with me for many years, long enough to teach the value of leaving at the right time. The market was good, the buyer clear, the terms clean. I chose to close while everything was still aligned, rather than squeeze out a few more percentage points and trade peace of mind for them. The funds landed in my account on schedule. I looked at the figure, confirmed it once, then closed the screen. For me, completion isn't about recounting, it's about knowing when to stop. 40 years in the profession taught me that the most durable satisfaction comes from decisions that don't need correction. I set up a small trust, not to do anything grand, just to turn my experience into something useful for others. The goal was simple: basic financial education for people entering adulthood who were never taught how to read a contract, understand risk, or ask questions before signing. No banners, no noisy fundraising. The program was lean and practical, focused on things everyone needs: budgeting, credit, legal obligations, and one essential principle: don't confuse emotion with financial responsibility. I chose a straightforward name for the trust, enough to signal what it does. I invited a few colleagues from the field, people who teach best by example rather than advice. We agreed on the approach: small classes, clear materials, no promises of quick wealth. The aim wasn't to create heroes, but to help people stand on their own. My life returned to its old rhythm: morning papers, midday walks, afternoons tending the small garden out back. Neighbors greeted me as before. I answered politely. Some evenings I opened my notebook and wrote a few lines about what I'd learned that day, not to remember, but to keep my thinking aligned. Claire texted occasionally, short, polite messages. I replied when appropriate, maintaining the boundaries we had set. The bond was still there, but the line was drawn. Things that break don't need hurried repairs. They need time to stand still before you know how to move forward. One afternoon, I stopped by the old building one last time, stood on the sidewalk and looked up. The signage had changed. Someone else was starting their chapter. I turned away without looking back. Some chapters only need to end cleanly, so the next has room to begin. That night, I sat at the desk, turned on the lamp, and wrote one sentence, not for anyone else, but for myself. It gathered a lifetime of professional practice into a single reminder of why I chose the way I did. 40 years in brokerage taught me one thing: not every deal should be saved. Some only need to end at the right time. This story, if examined closely, isn't as much about money as people assume. It's about boundaries. The moment I understood that standing still is sometimes the only way not to be dragged down. I'm not telling it to prove myself right or to make anyone else wrong. I'm telling it because some things, if not named in time, get mistaken for lifelong obligations. Family, in the end, isn't a place where you must sign everything just to keep the surface calm. Some choices don't need noise. They only need enough clarity for you to remain standing afterward. If you've ever sat in silence inside a house where the silence weighed more than words, ever considered a signature just because of the word family, leave a asht and tell me where you're listening to this story from. And if you want to keep walking with me through stories where truth is placed on the table with calm and boundaries are kept with dignity, I would sincerely appreciate a follow.